"I own you completely," Mountain Man declared to his weeping fat wife his hidden truth. "I own you completely," he said. The words fell heavy in the silence of the marble hall. The torches flickered along the corridor of Shadowmere Castle, and the air itself seemed to stop breathing. Felicity Rose's heart trembled beneath her wedding veil. Her father's debts born long before she was even alive had been sealed that morning with her name on a marriage contract. She wasn't a bride, she was collateral. Maximilian Shadowmere stood before her, tall and motionless, his silver hair gleaming like steel under the firelight. His eyes, ice blue and merciless, belonged to a man used to obedience, the lord of Sovereign Peak, the man who owned half the kingdom, and now her. The courtiers whispered, their laughter echoing off the walls. "A rose heart sold to a Shadowmere," one of them sneered. "Even her name fits her fate." Felicity felt her face burn. Her gown weighed 1,000 pounds, her breath caught between humiliation and fear. When the ceremony ended, Max did not offer his hand. He simply turned and said, "Follow me." Hours later, in the great chamber of Shadowmere, she stood alone with him for the first time. He signed the final document and closed the ledger with a snap. Then, in that cold, imperious voice, he said it again. "From this moment forward, Felicity, I own you completely." The candlelight trembled. She dropped to her knees, tears running freely. "Yes, my lord," she whispered. "I understand. I am yours to command. Just, please, be merciful." For a heartbeat, the great lord of Shadowmere said nothing, but when he finally spoke, his tone had changed, barely audible, almost tender. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I didn't buy you to possess you. I claimed you, so no one else ever could." Shadowmere Castle rose like a black crown on the mountain's edge, its towers piercing the clouds, its walls whispering stories of power and old debts. Every stone seemed to bear the weight of history, and now Felicity's life. When she arrived, snow began to fall silent, slow, almost reverent. The carriages disappeared down the mountain road, leaving her alone before the iron gates. The servants bowed stiffly, eyes avoiding hers. To them, she wasn't a lady of the house. She was payment. Inside, the castle glimmered with wealth, chandeliers dripping with crystal, portraits of long-dead Shadowmeres glaring down at her, and corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. Yet the air was cold, colder than the wind outside. Felicity followed Lord Shadowmere through those halls, her heart pounding. He moved with the precision of a general, each step measured, each glance heavy with command. She noticed his scar, a thin line across his jaw, pale against his skin, and wondered what war had left it behind. When they reached her chamber, he stopped. "This room is yours," he said. "No one enters without your permission, not even I." She blinked, confused. "But you said you owned me." His expression didn't change. "I do, and that means I'm responsible for your safety, your comfort, and your dignity. That is the meaning of ownership in my house." He turned to leave, his cloak swirling behind him. "Dinner is at 7. You'll join me." When the door closed, Felicity sank into the velvet chair and tried to breathe. Every lesson she'd been taught about noblemen told her to expect cruelty, command, and humiliation. Instead, he had given her silence and space. But silence could be terrifying, too. As dusk fell, she walked through the room that was now hers. It was vast, a canopy bed, a marble fireplace, a dressing table carved with roses. The window overlooked the valley below, where thousands of lanterns from the village flickered like stars. She remembered her father's words that morning, his voice shaking as he handed her the marriage contract. "It's the only way, Feli. Our family's debt to the Shadowmeres must be repaid. You'll be treated well, I think." He didn't meet her eyes. He never did. Now, sitting in this golden prison, Felicity realized the truth: she hadn't been saved. She had been traded. When the dinner bell rang, she descended the grand staircase, her steps echoing like confessions. Lord Shadowmere was waiting at the long oak table, alone. The meal had been set for 2 roasted pheasant, fresh bread, and wine that caught the firelight. He didn't speak at first. Only when she hesitated to sit did he glance up. "In my hall," he said, "you do not bow. You dine." Felicity obeyed, her trembling hands gripping the silverware. Between them stretched an ocean of silence and unspoken fear. Then, almost gently, he asked, "Do you know what your family's debt truly was, Felicity?" She shook her head. He leaned back, his eyes softening for the first time. "It wasn't gold they owed me. It was a promise broken centuries ago, and I intend to keep it not with chains, but with restoration." His words echoed long after dinner ended, and for the first time, Felicity wondered if the man who claimed to own her might actually be the only one trying to set her free. The days that followed felt like walking through a dream, one she wasn't sure was safe to wake from. Shadowmere Castle was both prison and sanctuary, its beauty shadowed by a silence that seemed to listen. Servants bowed as she passed, but no one dared speak to her. She was the lady bought by debt. At dawn, Felicity wandered through marble corridors lined with portraits. In every one, the same sharp eyes glared down lords of Shadowmere, generation after generation, each holding the same crest, a silver falcon, gripping a rose, her rose. In the great library, she found him. Maximilian Shadowmere sat beside a window of colored glass, sunlight bleeding through the panes and catching in his hair. He was reading an old leather-bound tome, his posture straight, his focus absolute. When he looked up, she froze. "You may enter," he said, his tone not harsh, but final. She curtsied awkwardly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You live here now. You cannot intrude upon your own home." The word home startled her. He gestured toward the bookshelves. "If you're to manage this estate, you should know what you inherit. Knowledge is the foundation of all power." "I thought I wasn't meant to have any," she murmured. For the first time, she saw the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "That's precisely why I intend to give it to you." From that day forward, their days took on a rhythm. At sunrise, he taught her the ledgers, how grain was stored, how taxes were collected, how each coin held a story. At midday, he walked with her through the village below, showing her the mines, the fields, the markets he oversaw. The people bowed deeply to him, but when their eyes met Felicity's, they softened. "You speak to them," he said one afternoon. What would I say? "Ask them what they need. Listen, leadership begins with that." So she did. She spoke to the blacksmith's wife, who needed grain for winter, to the miller, who begged for fair wages, to the orphans who gathered near the well, too frightened to approach the Lord himself. By evening, she would sit beside Max in the study, recounting everything she'd heard. He listened in silence, occasionally pouring her a glass of wine, his eyes studying her more than her words. "You have the instincts of a ruler," he told her one night. You see the people not as subjects, but as souls." Her cheeks warmed. "No one's ever said that to me." "That's because no one ever saw it." The snow melted. Weeks became months. Somewhere between the ledges and the laughter, the fear she had carried began to thaw. One evening, during a storm, thunder cracked over the mountains. The lights flickered. The wind howled through the castle. Felicity rushed to the window to close it, but a sudden gust caught her sleeve and slammed it open again. The wind knocked her off balance. Max was there before she fell, his arm locking around her waist. For a heartbeat, their faces were inches apart, the scent of rain between them, the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "Careful," he murmured, voice lower than she'd ever heard it. She couldn't speak. Her pulse thundered louder than the storm. He didn't release her right away. His hand lingered just a moment too long, gentle, grounding, real. Then he stepped back, his tone returning to its usual command. "You should rest, Lady Shadowmere. The storm will pass." But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking of his voice, the way it softened when he spoke her name. And for the first time since her forced marriage, Felicity began to wonder perhaps the real debt between their families was never about gold or bloodlines. Perhaps it was something older, deeper, something that felt dangerously like fate. Winter turned to spring, and for the first time in her life, Felicity Rosehart found herself waking not to fear, but to purpose. The castle that had once felt like a gilded cage now hummed with quiet life. Her mornings were spent walking the corridors with a ledger under her arm, her afternoons in the village, and her evenings by the great hearth of the western hall, where even Lord Shadowmere sometimes joined her, silent but not distant. The servants no longer looked at her with pity or curiosity. They called her my lady with warmth now. It was a subtle change, but she felt it in every bow, every smile that lingered a little longer than before. The transformation began one morning when Felicity entered the kitchen and found the staff struggling to manage supplies. Without hesitation, she rolled up her sleeves and began sorting baskets of grain herself. The maids gasped, "A lady of Shadowmere," touching sacks of flour. But she only laughed softly. "Order begins where chaos ends," she said, half to herself. When Maximilian learned of it that evening, he said nothing at first. Then he looked up from his papers and said, "You reorganized an entire kitchen in a day. You realize the household has been trying to do that for 3 years?" She smiled timidly. "Maybe they just needed permission." His gaze lingered, thoughtful. "Or maybe they needed you." It became their rhythm, his strategies, her empathy, his command, her compassion. Together, they restored what had long been broken within Shadowmere. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens newly coming into bloom, Felicity asked quietly, "Why do you trust me with so much, my lord? You barely knew me." Max paused by a stone archway covered in ivy. His expression softened, the distance in his eyes flickering for the first time. "Because you look at this place the way I once did before, power made me forget it was worth saving." She didn't know how to respond. The sincerity in his tone unsettled her more than his authority ever had. Inside the castle, life began to take on a new shape. Felicity oversaw the servants' quarters, improved their wages, and reopened the school for the children of the miners. She insisted on fresh bread for the sick and opened the long-closed infirmary. The castle, once ruled by silence, now rang with laughter. At night, she would find herself in the grand hall, reading by candlelight. Often Max would appear without warning, pouring himself a drink before sitting beside her in quiet companionship. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he only watched the fire. One night she asked, "Do you ever tire of carrying the weight of everything of everyone?" He stared into the flames for a long time before answering, "I tire only of pretending that I don't." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, fragile but undeniable. Days grew longer, softer. He began joining her in the village, walking among the people not as a lord, but as a man beside his wife. The villagers whispered of how Lady Shadowmere's kindness had changed the iron-hearted lord of the mountain. Then, one evening, a storm rolled over Sovereign Peak. The wind rattled the windows. Thunder shook the towers. Felicity was in the library when she heard a crash from the west wing. The old balcony had given way under the storm's force. Without thinking, she ran through the corridors, skirts flying, shouting for help. When she reached the fallen balcony, Max was already there, trying to lift a collapsed beam that pinned a servant boy to the ground. Rain soaked his hair. His hands bled as he struggled. Felicity dropped beside him without hesitation. "On my count," he said between gritted teeth. They heaved together. The beam moved an inch, then another enough for the boy to crawl free. He scrambled into her arms, sobbing. For a moment, Felicity and Max remained kneeling in the rain, breathing hard, faces streaked with mud. He looked at her, and something broke in his composure, the facade of control slipping away. "You could have been killed," he said hoarsely. "So could you," she replied, her voice trembling, "and yet here we are." His hand found hers in the rain. Neither spoke again. They simply stayed like that, two souls once bound by debt, now held together by something neither had the courage to name. That night, as the storm calmed, Felicity stood at her window and looked out over the valley. The lights of the village glowed like stars, and she thought of what Max had said weeks earlier about promises older than gold. Maybe, she thought, the Shadowmere debt had never been about ownership or repayment at all. Maybe it had always been about finding the one person strong enough to break the curse of loneliness that had haunted their bloodlines for centuries. And maybe, just maybe, she had been sent here not to pay a debt, but to end it. The peace of Shadowmere was short-lived. One morning, as the mist still clung to the mountains, a black-sealed letter arrived at the castle gates. The royal crest gleamed on the wax, a falcon devouring a rose. When Maximilian broke the seal, Felicity saw his face pale for the first time. "What is it?" she asked softly. He folded the parchment, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "A summons from the crown. They're reopening the Roseheart debt." Her breath caught. "But it's been settled. You said—" "I said I had forgiven it. The crown hasn't." The meaning struck her like ice. If the debt was reopened, everything, her home, the village, even the people under their care, could be seized by royal decree. And worse, she would once again become a bargaining piece. That night, when Max retreated to his study, Felicity followed him. The firelight flickered against his face as he sat among stacks of old ledgers and maps, his hand gripping a goblet of wine. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "What is this debt really?" For a long time he didn't answer. Then slowly he rose and opened a drawer. From it he drew an old yellowed scroll bound in silver thread. "This," he said, placing it before her, is the covenant of Shadowmere, signed over 200 years ago between my ancestor and yours." She leaned closer. The ink was faded, but legible. Her family's crest, a rose wrapped in flame, stood beside the falcon of Shadowmere. Her eyes moved to the words, "In return for mercy granted, the bloodline of Roseheart shall forever owe fealty, body, and service to the house of Shadowmere until the debt of betrayal is repaid in kind." "Betrayal?" she whispered. "What betrayal?" Max looked at her then, his expression haunted. "Your ancestor, Lady Helena Roseheart, was my forefather's betrothed. But on the eve of their wedding, she poisoned him, or so history claims. My family demanded justice. Her family begged for mercy. The crown spared them, but in exchange bound your bloodline to ours." Felicity's hands trembled as she traced the ink. "But that was centuries ago. None of us—" "It doesn't matter. To the crown, blood never forgets." The silence between them grew heavy. Finally she asked, "Do you believe it? Do you believe my family betrayed yours?" Max turned toward the fire, his shoulders tense. "I once did, until I met you." He poured the wine slowly, watching it swirl like dark silk. "You carry her name, the same compassion, the same defiance, and I've come to realize that perhaps the betrayal was never hers." "What do you mean?" He met her eyes. "I believe my ancestors lied. They used the accusation to seize the Roseheart lands to secure power. The debt was their weapon." Her breath hitched. "Then all of this, my marriage, my family's ruin, it was never about repayment. It was about control." "Yes," he said quietly, "and if the crown succeeds, they'll finish what my bloodline began." Anger flared inside her, pure, steady, righteous. "Then we'll stop them." He stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time not as a wife, but as an equal. "We?" Felicity straightened her shoulders. "You said once that you own me completely. Then use that ownership wisely. If I'm bound to this name, I'll fight for it." He smiled, faintly proud, almost reverent. "Then we fight together." From that night, Shadowmere changed. The castle turned into a war room. Felicity poured through archives, uncovering records of bribes, missing documents, and forged signatures. Max rode to the capital, calling in favors from nobles who owed him loyalty. But power breeds fear, and fear breeds enemies. Rumors began to spread that the Lady of Shadowmere was a witch, that she had enchanted her husband, that she sought to overthrow the throne itself. The whispers slithered through court corridors and reached the crown's ears. One morning, soldiers arrived at the base of the mountain. Their banners bore the royal crest. "They're coming for us," said the butler, breathless. Felicity stood at the window, her hand steady. "Then they'll find more than debt waiting." And when Max returned, his armor dark with dust and his eyes filled with stormlight, he said just one thing. "They want to take you, Feli, over my dead body." The mountain air was sharp with the scent of iron and rain. Clouds gathered over Sovereign Peak like a shroud, and below them the royal battalion ascended, armored riders, banners snapping in the wind, carrying the king's decree of seizure and arrest. Inside Shadowmere Castle, torches burned in every corridor. The servants whispered prayers. The villagers gathered at the gates with pitchforks and torches of their own. They weren't soldiers, but they were hers. Felicity stood on the balcony beside Maximilian, the valley stretching before them like a battlefield carved from fate. She wore a crimson cloak, the color of her family crest. He stood tall in his dark armor, the falcon sigil gleaming at his breast. They'll call us traitors, she said quietly. They already have, Max replied, but tonight they'll remember us as something else, defenders of our people. When the royal envoy rode forward under the white banner, his voice boomed across the courtyard. By decree of His Majesty, the House of Shadowmere is hereby dissolved. Lord Maximilian is charged with treason, and Lady Felicity Rosehart is ordered to surrender herself for trial. The words echoed like thunder. Felicity stepped forward before Max could stop her. "Tell your king," she shouted, her voice clear and fierce, "that debts paid in blood cannot be claimed again." A murmur rippled through the soldiers. The envoy sneered. "You defy the crown?" Max drew his sword, the steel catching the firelight. "No, we defy injustice." The battle began with a roar of hooves and the clash of steel. Shadowmere's gates held as arrows flew from the ramparts. Villagers fought beside the guards, and Felicity, refusing to hide, coordinated supplies and tended the wounded in the great hall. Her dress was stained with ash and sweat, but her eyes burned bright. When the enemy breached the courtyard, Max was there to meet them. His blade moved like lightning, each strike carrying the fury of generations wronged. But there were too many. He faltered, surrounded. Then, through the chaos, Felicity appeared, holding aloft the ancient scroll. "Stop!" she cried. The commander hesitated. "This covenant," she said, her voice trembling but strong, "was forged under the crown's seal, and within it lies your king's signature of mercy. If you destroy us, you destroy the royal oath itself." The commander glanced at the seal, his eyes widening. Behind him, soldiers murmured. No one dared raise a sword against the king's own mark. At last, the commander lowered his blade. "Stand down!" he ordered. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of rain. Max dropped to one knee beside her, his sword clattering to the ground. "You did it," he whispered. Felicity looked at him through tears and smiled faintly. "We did it. Together." As dawn broke over the valley, the royal banners retreated down the mountain, and Shadowmere stood untouched. But more than the castle had been saved that night. A curse had been broken, one born not of law or blood, but of fear. And from its ashes rose something far greater than any title or debt. Love. Weeks later, sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of Shadowmere Castle. The banners of the crown now hung beside those of House Rosehart, no longer as emblems of power and submission, but as equals. Word had spread across the realm. The Rosehart debt was abolished, the ancient lie erased from the royal archives. The king himself, faced with the revelation of the forged covenant, sent a decree of pardon and an apology. Felicity stood in the great hall as the villagers gathered to celebrate. The laughter of children echoed through the marble corridors where silence once reigned. She moved among them not as a lady above, but as one of them, sleeves rolled, hands dusted with flour from the communal feast. When the celebration quieted, Maximilian approached her by the fireplace, the same one before which she had once trembled in fear. His armor was gone. He wore simple linen, his expression softer than she had ever seen. He took her hand, his voice low but certain. "The day I said I owned you, I thought I was claiming a debt. But you taught me that love is not possession, it's the choice to protect, even when you could control." Felicity smiled, tears bright in her eyes. "And you taught me that strength doesn't come from defiance alone, it comes from standing beside someone who believes in you." Outside, bells rang from the village below, not tolling war or judgment, but celebration. The curse of centuries had lifted. That night, as the torches flickered along the ramparts, Felicity whispered into the quiet, "The Roseheart debt is over." Max turned toward her, his hand resting over hers. "No," he said softly, "it's finally paid not in gold, but in love." And so ends the tale of Felicity Roseheart and Lord Maximilian of Shadowmere, a story born from debt, but reborn through love, trust, and redemption. They began as prisoner and master, bound by law and legacy, yet became partners who rewrote the meaning of power itself. Because love, when true, does not conquer, it restores. Every time I tell a story like this, I'm reminded that no soul is too broken, no past too heavy, and no heart too lost to be healed. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and do you still believe in second chances?